Hello, Laura Trevelyan here, and as you can see, we are in the Great Australian Outdoors for the first of this year's videos, which are examining Australian writers and particularly Australian motifs and modes of writing, and how you can use that to really enhance your own. So this week we are having a look at really one of my favourite Australian writers, a writer who kicked off my reading of Australian writers in earnest. I had read Australian writers, as I mentioned in my last video, but this is the one where I read her books and I thought, oh, I can see myself, I can find myself in this world. And that person is Elizabeth Harrower. Elizabeth Harrower died only a few years ago, and she was writing the majority of her work in the mid-century, so the 50s and the 60s. She wrote a few books and then she stopped. So there are only about four or five books and a book of short stories that Elizabeth Harrower wrote, so it's very easy to read everything that she ever wrote. But Elizabeth Harrower did, when I read her for the first time, she really struck a chord with me. She was very highly thought of when she was writing, and I believe she's still now, having been rediscovered, very highly thought of. She's one of, unfortunately, many Australian writers who found that their position in Australia was lost because the books went out of print. Geordie Williamson talks about this in his book, The Burning Library. I'll put some notes down about that book in below if you're interested, talking about forgotten Australian writers, and Elizabeth Harrower is one of those. So too is Patrick White. We're going to talk about Patrick White in our next video, so keep tuned for that. Talking about Patrick White, Elizabeth Harrower was admired by Patrick White and considered as great a writer at times as Patrick White. In fact, her book, The Watchtower, was published in the same year as Patrick White's The Solid Mandala, and it is said that if Patrick White hadn't published his book in that year, she would have won the Miles Franklin for I think it's 1968, 5, I'll check, but she would have won the Miles Franklin for that. So she really, at the time she was writing, at the time she was well known, she was very well thought of. And when you read the books, you understand why she was so well thought of. These are some fascinating books. Down in the City, there's one set in Newcastle, and its name has just slipped my mind entirely. I'll put that down as well. And The Watchtower are three books that really, if you're going to read them, if you're going to start with Elizabeth Harrower, read those. Read those three books are the absolute crucial books to read. Mostly The Watchtower, though I will add a caveat to The Watchtower as we go on. What she does with writing is quite fascinating. She evokes place unbelievably well. Her books are set, well, The Watchtower is set in Sydney, Down in the City is set in Sydney, and the other one is set in Newcastle, which are all places that she knew very well, and the way that she evokes place is amazing. You are in Sydney. You are feeling Sydney. And Sydney itself becomes, in The Watchtower, a character. It becomes a counterpart, an ironic counterpart to the beauty of the harbour and this beautiful white house in Neutral Bay on the harbour, and what the darkness that is happening within that house. The juxtaposition of these two things is so well done. It feels, when you think of Australia, you think it's impossible for this place to feel oppressive, and yet she manages to make this house oppressive in spite of the openness and beauty that is around it, or rather because of. The Watchtower also, much like Down in the City, takes fairy tale. In Down in the City, it is a fairy tale. I think it's more Sleeping Beauty, one of those fairy tales. In the Watchtower, it is very much Bluebeard. Bluebeard, the murderous husband. And it starts very much, the Watchtower starts very much like a fairy tale. These two girls, the Varsi sisters, are told that their father is dead and that their mother, as soon as she is able, is going and living in England. And they are left alone in the world. The eldest, Laura, goes and gets a job with a man named Felix, who she then marries. As you're reading this, as the reader, you're reading it and you're thinking, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. We can see where this is going. But she wants to provide this stability for her sister, and so she marries Felix and brings her sister to live with her. The second part of the novel, because as the reader, we're left with that smug feeling at the end of the first part, I know where this is going. The second part of the novel, and this is where my caveat about approach this with caution. If you are someone whose experiences mean that reading a book about coercive control is likely to be very triggering, then this is probably not the book for you. However, if you are curious about what coercive control looks like, because you've heard the term and you have never experienced that yourself, then this is a very good book to understand what is happening in those relationships. It is terrifying and oppressive. So we go from this knowing reader of, oh, I know where this is going, to being one of the women in the house terrorized by Felix. Now, it's very important to remember, which is an important thing about coercive control, Felix is never actually violent, not physically violent. And that's what makes it so terrifying. It just builds and builds and builds, and there is never a break. It never breaks. What breaks it eventually for the book, because you can't just build that, you need a resolution of some kind, is that the younger sister is able to leave. That is the third part of the book, is that leaving, that getting out. And where does she go? She goes bush. She doesn't go to the country. You see, in American or English books, they would talk about going to the country. She doesn't go to the country because what is west of Sydney? West of Sydney is the Blue Mountains. What are the Blue Mountains? The Blue Mountains are bush. She gets on a train and she goes bush. She escapes. And so the way that this is built, the way that this young woman gains the confidence to leave, is what gives this book its ending. And it's what allows you have a fairy tale beginning, you have a truly nightmarish centre, and then you have a liberated ending. So it's a very, very fascinating book. It's a very carefully put together book. You also get some incredibly toxic characters in Elizabeth Harrower's writing. The grandmother from the book in Newcastle is one of the most evil bitches you could possibly meet. It also speaks very much to the anti-intellectualism that you find rampant, especially in mid-century Australia, where Donald Horne called it the lucky country. Not a compliment, contrary to many people's belief. If we're the lucky country, it's only because we fell on our ass backwards into luck, not because we did anything to deserve it. And he talks about that anti-intellectual streak that runs through Australia. When Elizabeth Harrower was writing this book, this was still the time where anyone who had any intellectual ambitions left the country. So yeah, Clive James leaves the country, Germaine Greer leaves the country. The idea, this anti-intellectualism really comes to the fore in some of Elizabeth Harrower's books. In fact, it also comes to the fore in Patrick White's books. Patrick White felt that he was obliged. He was obliged to stay in the country to hold the line. He was very critical of that anti-intellectual culture that you see within Australia at this period. Fortunately, this is something that has lessened over time, though that anti-intellectualism in recent times, as we have seen, continues to reassert itself. However, as more Australians have actually attained university qualifications, this has become a less strident component of Australian society. You do still find it in older Australians, though. So but she talks very much about this. She also has a lot of these girls, these girls who are the Australian girls who are going to make it, because that is the other thing. We're going to talk about Australian girls, but one of the places that you find Australian girls is places of higher learning, which I will explain in another video. But it is a very particular trait of Australian women, is that women in Australian novels are often kicking back against this anti-intellectualism, which you see Elizabeth Harrower doing in her books. So, thank you for joining me for Elizabeth Harrower. Next time I see you, we're going to tackle the monster. Not that he's actually a monster, but we're going to tackle Patrick White. I don't want to leave Patrick White too long because people are afraid of Patrick White. He has an imposing reputation, and I would like to challenge that straight on, because if you don't encounter Patrick White, you are missing out. Let me tell you that to start with. But anyway, that's all for me today. I hope you go and check out Elizabeth Harrower. Strongly, strongly, strongly recommend her. And I will see you later in our next visit. Bye-bye.